The diner fell silent as a woman in a wheelchair, Nina Johnson, quietly wiped down the table. But when a group of rowdy men entered, their cruel words aimed at her, the tension in the room grew thick. Wheelchairs should stay at home. One of them mocked. Nina's heart raced, but she didn't respond. Then, without warning, one of them shoved her chair, sending her crashing to the floor. Laughter filled the air, but no one helped. Just when the humiliation seemed unbearable, the unmistakable roar of a military Humvee cut through the silence. 3 Marines stormed in, their presence commanding immediate respect. Their gazes locked on Nina. The atmosphere changed in an instant. No one pushes a Marine and gets away with it. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Nina Johnson sat quietly at her usual table in the corner of Montana's Welcome Home Diner, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long, peaceful shadows across the old wooden floors. At 46, Nina had grown accustomed to the silent stare she often received. The loss of her left leg in a bomb explosion during a mission overseas was not something that could be hidden. The scarred, prosthetic limb that replaced her real leg was a constant reminder of the battle she had fought, both on the battlefield and within herself. For most of the day, the diner was calm, a quiet place where the regulars gathered to sip coffee and exchange stories. Nina liked it this way. It was in this quiet, predictable routine that she found comfort, a small piece of normalcy after all the chaos she had experienced in her life. The diner owner, Mike, had hired her without hesitation when she applied for the job. There were no pitying looks or awkward questions, just a handshake between 2 veterans, a silent understanding that spoke louder than words. Here, Nina wasn't a disabled veteran. She was just another person doing her job. But that peaceful silence shattered in an instant. The door jingled sharply as 4 men entered, their boisterous laughter and loud voices breaking through the stillness. Nina looked up briefly, noticing the group as they made their way to a table near the counter. She recognized one of them immediately, Ted Miller. She had seen him around town, a man with a reputation for causing trouble. Ted had been dishonorably discharged from the army years ago, and it seemed he had found a new hobby in tormenting people he deemed weaker than himself. Nina felt a tension rise in her chest as the men settled into their booth. Ted's loud voice filled the room, talking about everything from politics to sports. But it wasn't his words that bothered Nina. It was the way his gaze flicked toward her as if searching for a target. She had dealt with bullies before, on the battlefield and in civilian life, but something about Ted's presence made her instinctively stiffen. Well, Ted's voice rang out across the diner, loud enough for everyone to hear. Look who we have here, the half-soldier on wheels. His words were sharp, mocking, meant to belittle her in front of the whole diner. Nina kept her eyes down, focusing on the napkins she was folding, trying to ignore the sting of his words. She had learned the hard way that some battles were better fought by staying silent. Isn't it against the health code to have cripples handling food? Ted continued, his voice laced with cruelty. The laughter of his friends followed, filling the space with an uncomfortable tension. Nina's grip on the napkin tightened, but she refused to acknowledge him. She had heard worse in her time as a Marine. She had faced death, dealt with wounds that had left scars both visible and hidden. But this was different. This was the humiliation of being singled out in front of a room full of strangers. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the anxiety that began to knot in her stomach. She moved toward a nearby table, collecting empty coffee cups with practiced ease, her wheelchair moving smoothly across the floor. "Can I get you gentlemen menus?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing tension. She knew that if she kept moving, kept working, she could keep her emotions in check. Ted didn't let up. "Sure thing, Wheels," he called after her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Roll it over quick, huh?" His friend snickered, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Nina's knuckles whitened on the handles of her wheelchair, but she didn't respond. She had learned from her years of service that not every insult required a reply. Some words were better left unheard. As Nina made her way back to their table, with the menus, Ted's voice dropped to a whisper, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "How did a woman even get into the Marines?" he sneered. "Some diversity quota, I bet." Nina's hands trembled slightly on the menus, but she kept her face impassive, refusing to let him see how deeply his words cut. Ted wasn't done. His voice rose again, this time with a mockingly friendly tone. "I've served with females in the army," he continued, "but women like you are why the military is soft these days." The words hung in the air, a challenge that threatened to boil over into something more. Nina could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her eyes fixed on the table, silently counting to 10 in her mind. She placed the menus in front of the men with precision, her voice calm as she recited the special of the day. "Today's special is meatloaf," she said, her tone even, betraying none of the tension she felt inside. Ted's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. Nina's eyes flickered to the eagle globe and anchor tattoo on her forearm, the symbol of the Marines visible beneath the rolled sleeve of her shirt. "So, you really were a Marine?" Ted taunted, his grip tightening. "Let me guess. Office duty, filing papers while the real soldiers were out there fighting." Nina felt the sharpness of his grip, but she didn't flinch. "Remove your hand," she said quietly, her voice low but firm, the steel beneath her tone unmistakable. Ted let go, but not without a dismissive shove, a final push meant to degrade her further. "Women like you are why America can't win wars anymore," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. Nina continued without acknowledging him. She had been trained to handle situations like this, to keep her composure in the face of disrespect. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. But the humiliation she felt from Ted's words was undeniable. It was different from the battles she had fought in the past, and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. As Nina turned to leave, Ted thrust his boot forward, blocking her path. "Did I dismiss you, Marine?" he taunted. "Stand at attention when I'm talking to you." Nina maneuvered her wheelchair around the obstruction with ease, her movement smooth and practiced. "Your server will be with you shortly," she said, her voice steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. Ted's mocking laughter followed her as she wheeled herself to the back of the diner. "Wheelchair warriors should stay home," he called after her, his words aimed to wound. "If you can't stand on your own 2 feet, don't make it everyone else's problem." The sound of cruel laughter echoed through the diner, but no one stepped in to stop it. Nina continued to the back, her face, a mask of discipline hiding the pain she felt deep inside. She didn't expect anyone to help. She had fought in a war, survived bombings, and witnessed death up close. But this was different. The humiliation stung more than any injury ever could. The diner's hum returned to a strange kind of stillness, but Nina's thoughts remained a whirlwind. The sting of Ted's words and the weight of the humiliation hung over her like a cloud. She wheeled herself quietly into the back of the diner, away from the eyes that were still watching, pretending not to look. Her chest was tight, her body rigid with the effort to keep her emotions in check. She was a Marine, trained to withstand physical and mental pain. Yet as she rolled through the narrow kitchen door, she couldn't help but feel the sharpness of those words reverberating through her mind, cutting deeper than any blast had ever done. In the back, Mike, the diner owner, noticed her tense posture as she passed by. He didn't say anything, just gave her a quick nod of acknowledgement. He had seen Nina go through hell, both on the battlefield and in civilian life. He knew there were things she preferred not to talk about, the scars that ran deeper than the ones people could see. But today, the scene out front had been different. It wasn't the usual discomfort she endured from the ignorant stares or well-meaning, but awkward questions. This was blatant cruelty. Ted's mocking had stripped away any semblance of dignity she had hoped to salvage. The room had fallen into a tense silence when Nina had returned to her corner, each patron uncertain of how to act. The group of men at the booth had resumed their conversation, but now their words were quieter, unsure, as if even they sensed that they had crossed a line. But the discomfort didn't last long. The murmur of the diner was quickly interrupted by the unmistakable rumble of an engine outside, loud, commanding, and authoritative. A Humvee, the kind Nina had seen countless times in the military, came to a halt outside with a screeching of tires. Nina's gaze shifted towards the window, her heartbeat quickening instinctively. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling this wasn't just any arrival. This wasn't a regular customer driving through. The engine's roar was too much like the ones that had brought her team into danger during her missions overseas. The door to the diner swung open with a force that made the bell jangle. The familiar scent of frying bacon and brewing coffee briefly mixed with the crisp air from outside as three figures stepped through the door. There was no noise, no announcement. Just the sound of boots clicking against the diner's tiled floor. The first figure was a man who moved with quiet, purposeful steps. Sergeant Rick Delgado was older than most of the Marines Nina had worked with, his gray hair cropped short but still holding a kind of pride in its stiffness. He carried a polished cane that seemed out of place for a soldier, but the look in his eyes showed he had fought his share of battles, on the ground and in his personal life. There was something about him, something about the way he carried himself, that made Nina sit up straighter in her wheelchair, as though she recognized an old kind of authority. Behind him was Corporal Luis Martinez, young but carrying a weight of experience in his posture. The way he walked, with his shoulders squared and eyes forward, showed that he had seen things that made a person grow up faster than most. His uniform was immaculate, his Marine Corps insignia gleaming, and his focus was fixed on the task ahead. But his movements were fluid, almost like he had been born with the knowledge of military precision. The third was a woman, Captain Allison Moore, a figure whose presence seemed to demand attention, even without saying a word. She was tall, her uniform adorned with medals that spoke to the tours she had seen in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Her eyes were sharp, and despite her gentle demeanor, Nina knew enough to recognize the resolve that radiated from her. They didn't speak. Their silence instead filled the room, commanding respect without even trying. It was as if they had entered the diner with the sole purpose of being noticed, and in an instant, everyone in the room realized that this was not a group to be trifled with. The three Marines moved in perfect sync, their strides as coordinated as any military operation. They didn't need to announce their arrival or make grand gestures. Their mere presence was enough to shift the atmosphere in the diner from discomfort to something deeper, something more powerful. Sergeant Delgado paused before Nina's table, his gaze soft but full of purpose. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," he said, his voice carrying a quiet but deep authority. "Forgive our delayed response, ma'am." He saluted her with precision, the formal gesture a quiet symbol of respect for what she had endured. His greeting was a formal acknowledgement, but it felt personal, like he had seen what Nina had gone through and had arrived to finally make things right. Nina's heart skipped a beat, her instincts firing in a way they hadn't since her time in the service. She returned the salute instinctively, her military training taking over. There was no hesitation in her movement, just the practiced strength of someone who had lived a lifetime of discipline and respect. She straightened in her chair, her body suddenly feeling more alive than it had in hours. "At ease, Sergeant," she said, her voice strong but calm, filled with the kind of confidence only earned through years of service. The diner, which had once been filled with the echoes of mocking laughter and tense whispers, was now completely still. Everyone watched as the Marine stood before Nina, and the man who had humiliated her earlier, Ted, shifted uneasily in his seat. The power of Nina's recognition by the Marines was palpable, and without saying a word, their presence forced a change in the room. The once noisy and disrespectful patrons were now quiet, unsure of how to respond to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "May we join you, ma'am?" Sergeant Delgado asked, gesturing to the empty chairs at Nina's table. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the respect it carried. Nina nodded, her chest lifting slightly as the weight of the earlier humiliation began to lift. She felt the eyes of the room on her, but now she didn't feel small or out of place. For the first time that day, she felt seen, not as a woman in a wheelchair, but as a Marine. The three Marines sat down, their presence creating a small island of calm in the middle of the chaotic diner. Sergeant Delgado exchanged a brief glance with Captain Moore, who smiled subtly before turning her attention back to Nina. The shift in the room's energy was undeniable. What had started as an afternoon of cruelty had turned into a moment of redemption, and for Nina, the arrival of these Marines felt like a promise that she was not alone. From the kitchen, Mike watched the scene unfold, and for the first time, he felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He hadn't known how deep Nina's scars went, but he knew now that she was not just a survivor of war. She was a survivor of life itself. And this was the moment when the diner's silence would no longer be broken by mockery. It would be broken by honor. The air in the diner had shifted completely. What had once been a tense, uncomfortable place, filled with the cruel mockery of Ted and his friends, was now silent except for the soft murmur of the Marines speaking in low tones to Nina. The rest of the patrons, still seated in their booths, couldn't help but turn their eyes toward the table where the three Marines had joined Nina. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. It was as though an invisible weight had lifted from the room, and for the first time since the incident with Ted, Nina could breathe easily. Sergeant Delgado, still standing at attention despite his age and the limp that came from injuries sustained in combat, looked across the diner with a quiet intensity. His sharp eyes seemed to take in every detail, the awkward, uncomfortable glances from the patrons, the sudden silence, the way Ted and his friends were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He could feel the tension building, and he knew this moment would be one to remember, not just for Nina but for everyone in this diner. He turned back to Nina, his voice calm but firm. "Staff Sergeant Johnson, you've earned more respect than anyone in this room could know, and today we're going to make sure that's recognized. Your courage, your sacrifices, they don't go unnoticed. Not by us." Nina felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had been through so much, and for so long her service had been something she carried quietly, hidden from the world. She hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge her, to make it known that her pain and struggles mattered. But now, in this small diner, she was seeing a side of the world she hadn't experienced in years, the honor and respect that came with being part of something greater, something that went beyond just one person. Captain Moore, the female officer with the perfectly pressed uniform and the gleaming medals that spoke of her years of service, leaned forward slightly. "Nina," she began, her voice smooth and steady, "I don't know if you remember me, but I served with you during your last tour in Kandahar. I was in your unit when the IED hit your convoy. I still remember the way you led us through the smoke and chaos, keeping everyone together when things seemed hopeless." Nina's eyes widened in recognition. The memories flooded back, of that day in Kandahar, the heat, the explosion, the way everything had fallen apart in an instant. But amidst the terror and confusion, it was Nina who had held the group together. She had been the one to take charge, to push them forward, even when her own body was racked with pain. She had saved lives that day, including her own, and now here was this Marine, a younger soldier, acknowledging her strength. "I remember you, Corporal Martinez," Nina said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "You were barely out of training, and you still followed me without hesitation. That day we all learned what it means to never leave anyone behind." Corporal Martinez gave her a small, respectful nod. "Ma'am, it was you who showed us what true courage looked like. I never forgot that." At that moment, Nina felt something stirred deep within her, a sense of pride that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. She had given so much of herself to her country, to her fellow Marines, and now, in this diner, she was finally being seen. Not as a woman in a wheelchair, not as a person broken by war, but as a Marine, a sister in arms worthy of honor and respect. Sergeant Delgado, sensing the shift in Nina's demeanor, turned to face the rest of the diner. His voice, though not loud, carried with it the kind of authority that only comes from years of service and experience. "Everyone in this room needs to understand something," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Nina Johnson is a hero. She's earned more than just respect. She's earned our admiration. She's earned her place among us." The words hit the patrons like a wave. The uncomfortable whispers and awkward glances from the tables near Ted's group slowly began to fade. Eyes that had been averted now turned to Nina, some with hesitation, others with growing respect. The message was clear. The Marines had spoken, and their presence was undeniable. Ted, who had once been so vocal in his ridicule, shifted uneasily in his seat. His bravado had disappeared, replaced by a quiet discomfort. The Marines' words and their unwavering gaze had deflated him in ways Nina had never expected. He glanced over at his friends, none of whom dared to make eye contact with the Marines. The tables that had once echoed with laughter now felt strangely cold. At that moment, Lieutenant Claire Thompson, the female Marine who had stood silently by the others, spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "What happened here today? What you did to Nina," she paused, looking directly at Ted and his group, "is not just disrespectful, it's unacceptable. Every Marine understands the code of honor. We protect those who can't protect themselves. We fight for those who are in need, and we never leave anyone behind." Her words lingered in the air, hanging heavy in the silence. Nina felt the strength in the room shift from a moment of humiliation to one of empowerment. The Marines had not only restored her dignity, but they had also reminded everyone present of what true honor meant. They had come into this diner not just to support her, but to set things right in a way that Nina couldn't have done on her own. Ted, now visibly shrinking under the weight of the Marines' words, let out a sigh and stood up. His friends followed suit, though none of them spoke. Without a word, they gathered their things and left, the door swinging shut behind them with an almost finality. The diner, once filled with the sounds of mockery and laughter, was now left in an eerie stillness. As the group of Marines sat down at Nina's table, the tension in the diner began to dissipate. One by one, patrons began to rise, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The elderly man in the corner, who had been watching the whole scene unfold, stood at attention and nodded solemnly toward Nina. Others followed, some saluting, others simply standing, their heads bowed in silent recognition. It wasn't just Nina who was being honored in that moment. The entire diner had become a space of respect, a place where the meaning of sacrifice and honor were understood by everyone present. Nina, still sitting in her wheelchair, felt something inside her shift. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen, for everything she had given, not just as a Marine, but as a person. The weight of the day's events, of the humiliation, was finally lifting. She was not just a veteran with scars, but a woman with strength and courage, someone who had earned a place at this table, a place of honor. And as the coffee cups were refilled, as the Marines spoke in low voices, Nina realized that, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she belonged. The diner, once quiet with an undercurrent of tension, had now transformed into a place of unspoken respect. Nina sat in her wheelchair, surrounded by the three Marines, their presence a protective shield that made her feel stronger than she had in days. The chairs around her were filled with men and women who had stood up for her, who had witnessed the transformation of a painful moment into one of solidarity and honor. It was as though the air itself had changed, thickened with the weight of the Marines' words, their silent but resolute defense of Nina. Sergeant Delgado, still standing tall despite the cane he used to support his injured leg, leaned back slightly, his eyes scanning the diner. The earlier awkwardness had faded. Now it was replaced by a quiet admiration from the other patrons. There was a ripple of change that spread through the room, a ripple that began with Nina's dignity and continued with the Marines' unwavering support. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to this," Nina said quietly, her voice filled with a rare vulnerability as she looked up at Sergeant Delgado. People staring, not knowing what to say. "It's like I'm constantly being reminded of what I've lost." Sergeant Delgado, ever the steady presence, nodded slowly. "You didn't lose anything, Nina. What you gave, what you sacrificed, is something that most people will never understand. But we do. And that's why we're here. To remind you that your strength is something to be proud of." Captain Moore, who had been quietly observing the exchange, gave a small, encouraging smile. "The world has a way of trying to make you feel small, especially when you've given so much. But that's not the truth of it. The truth is, you stand, taller than most. Nina felt the lump in her throat, but she didn't let herself cry. She hadn't cried in years, not since the explosion in Kandahar that had taken her leg, not since she had returned home to a world that couldn't see past her scars. But something in the way the Marines spoke to her, in the way they had shown up when it mattered most, began to chip away at the walls she had carefully built around herself. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking with the weight of gratitude she had been holding back for so long. "I didn't think anyone would ever understand. I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me." Captain Moore's expression softened, and she reached over, placing a hand on Nina's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. That's what family is for, Marine family. We look out for each other no matter where we are or what we're going through." It wasn't just the words that moved Nina, but the sincerity behind them. The three Marines who had walked into the diner were not strangers. They were people who understood the sacrifices she had made, the struggles she faced, and they had shown up to give her something she hadn't realized she needed: recognition, respect, and a reminder that her service had not been in vain. As the meal continued, the conversations grew lighter, the atmosphere less tense. The tension that had been building up in Nina's chest throughout the day was finally beginning to lift. She smiled as she shared a quiet laugh with Sergeant Delgado over an old military joke that only they would understand. Corporal Martinez, with his easygoing nature, shared stories from his early days in the Corps, and even Captain Moore, who usually kept her composure, let out a chuckle as they discussed some of their more humorous training mishaps. For the first time in a long time, Nina felt like herself again. Not the injured veteran, not the woman who had been pushed aside, but the Marine who had once led a team through a dangerous mission, who had kept them alive when it seemed impossible. But it wasn't just the Marines who were beginning to change. As the conversation continued, the other patrons in the diner began to shift in their seats. They no longer looked at Nina with pity or discomfort. Instead, they watched with curiosity, with respect, as they listened to the quiet conversations between Nina and her fellow Marines. There were no more whispers or sideways glances. There was a silent acknowledgement from everyone around that Nina was not just a woman in a wheelchair. She was a Marine, a woman who had given everything for her country, and she deserved every ounce of respect that came her way. Even Ted, who had left the diner in silence earlier, seemed to feel the weight of his actions. He had been the loudest, most brash presence in the room just hours ago. But now, as he sat in the parking lot of the diner with his friends, he looked out at the Marine's Humvee, parked at the curb, and felt something inside him shift. He didn't know what it was: shame, guilt, or maybe just the realization that he had messed with the wrong person. Back inside, Nina didn't notice him anymore. She was focused on the conversation at hand, on the laughter shared between old comrades and new friends. The meal had come to an end, and the three Marines stood to leave. As they did, Sergeant Delgado placed a card on Nina's table, a business card with a number written on the back. "Next time, Nina," he said, his voice low and serious, "you call us directly. We don't leave our own behind." Nina smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I will," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you, all of you." The three Marines stood for a moment longer, their gazes sweeping the diner once more. There was a finality to their presence, a quiet declaration that Nina was not just some invisible person passing through this world. She was a Marine, a sister, and she would be honored as such. As they exited the diner, a silence fell over the room, but this time it was not one of discomfort or tension. It was a silence of respect, of recognition. The patrons sat back in their chairs, many of them reflecting on what they had just witnessed. And for the first time in a long time, Nina felt the weight of the world shift. She had been humiliated, yes, but that humiliation had turned into something far greater: respect, honor, and the kind of community that could only be forged through shared experience. In the days that followed, things began to change in the diner. The sign outside, once plain and unassuming, was replaced with a new one: Diner of the Brave. Inside, the booths where veterans once sat alone were now filled with a new sense of camaraderie. The community had transformed, as had Nina, and as the weeks passed, she continued to come to work, still folding napkins and serving coffee with quiet efficiency. But now, she wore her Marine Corps pin proudly on her collar, and her wheelchair displayed a small flag, a symbol of the honor that had been restored to her both inside and out. For Nina, the greatest battle was not the one fought on foreign soil, but the one fought within her own heart, the battle to reclaim her dignity, her strength, and her place in the world. And in that moment, in the diner of the brave, she knew she had won. She would never stand alone again.